Welcome to Maintainable, the podcast where we explore the art, and sometimes the mess, of software that lasts. I talk with seasoned practitioners who have spent years navigating technical debt, untangling legacy systems, and helping teams build software that can survive change. Because good software isn't just about shipping fast, it's about making it last. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, we're joined by Sally Lait, a fractional technology leader, speaker, and advisor with more than 2 decades in the software industry. In our conversation, Sally and I talk about modernizing long-lived parts of a codebase, navigating the cultural and organizational dynamics that surface when teams move away from legacy in-house systems, and why signals like documentation, onboarding time, and team confidence can help often reveal more about maintainability than the code itself. Sally joins us from Suffolk in the east of the United Kingdom. Sally Lait, welcome to Maintainable.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really pleased that we made this conversation happen.
Likewise. Let's get into it. So, Sally, given your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
Before I jump in, I was going to say, I love that you ask this to everybody. I've been listening through. Everybody gives such fantastically varied answers. So hopefully I can add to the conversation a little bit. But I think that there's a mix. So there's the more kind of directly related traits that we often maybe think of first. So things like code being really well structured, following any standards that are in place, having the ability to be reviewed in a really timely manner, all of that kind of stuff. But the bit that I think is personally really interesting are the indicators kind of more around the fringes of those kind of attributes. So things like the quality, the discovery of documentation are a really good indicator, I have found in my experience, of the maintainability. The way that teams kind of interact with each other to share their knowledge about it, how fast people can onboard, that kind of stuff. So you've got all of these really kind of cultural elements that play into not only the maintainability itself, because documentation helps maintainability, but they can also be good indicators of how maintainable is your code base. And there's all sorts of stuff. So it's not just the quantifiable, it's the qualitative as well. So how confident do people feel? What do people feel about speed and the ability to kind of ship fast or change approach? All of those kind of more qualitative attributes are really, really interesting as well.
But aren't these qualitative things slightly subjective? So how do we reason about this as software engineering in our roles as leaders and as just members of an engineering team? To be like, well, the team feels very confident or doesn't feel very confident. I'm like, that's hard to report back to those that might not really understand what our day-to-day world looks like.
Oh, absolutely. And it will always be subjective, because I think what one team finds good or easy is going to be very different in a different setup, but you can only work within the boundaries of your team. I think a great example here is from my time at Farewell, where we actually had a quarterly survey that we did for the engineers by the engineers. And this was something that an amazing engineer called Charlotte had started before I joined, so I can't take the credit. But we used it to really kind of highlight the gaps in some of these kind of areas. And it was similar to, you might have done things like team health checks, but on a bit of a wider scale. I've done similar in other companies, but this one in particular really stands out to me because it was that mix of the subjectivity, how are people feeling? What's the gut check? But also you can drill down into some actual metrics. So things like how long does it take new starters to contribute to a certain area of the code base is very measurable. You can see that changing over time. You can directly attribute some of the changes you're making to those kind of metrics. But then there are other things like, how confident do people feel in their day-to-day work, which is so difficult because people need to feel that they are able to share honestly. They need to be able to be vulnerable about that kind of thing. So you're not necessarily always going to get the right sort of answer. You're not going to get that honesty straight off the bat. It takes a while to kind of build the culture and to create the foundations where people can truly speak out about these things.
That makes sense. And so I find that sometimes when as someone that runs a company and we've done our own different variations of DX scores and things of that nature over the years, and I'm assuming that might be kind of something similar that as you mentioned, Charlotte had set up at a prior organization you were at. And I'm curious about when I always feel sometimes I'm well, there's always so much content. I feel if anything, they're conversation starters, at least get the idea that the team can talk about these things, be like, all right, well, what's going on here? And what might be some signals that we could talk about and to assess some way if things are seemingly healthy or not. One of the things I've also seen been an interesting thing, or at least observed maybe anecdotally from my own team, but from consulting engagements where we go in and help other teams and they're navigating their own things, is that sometimes sentiment can be like, well, it feels like the similar things keep popping up and the team can show that they've made meaningful progress on improving certain things, yet there's still like this undercurrent of people still keep reporting that like, I don't feel very confident. The test coverage in our application is not where we would like it to be. Things are not improving. And there's like this kind of, the reality is they have been investing time and energy into it, but the metrics aren't showing that because sentiment is still a little like, what do you think kind of goes on in that situation? What's creating that delta there?
The short answer would be human nature, I guess, and the messy side of people. I think that, again, this kind of comes back to the difference in the team culture, the individuals you've got on the team. And some people, some fantastic engineers are always striving to be better, right? So even if you make those improvements, it could still be better. It could still be faster. It could still be less buggy. And so I think that there's an unhealthy way of looking at that, where it's pure kind of complaints. We never get to do anything. We never have time to pay down debt. And even if those things are improving, there's still that kind of perception. And if that's the case, then I think it's really worth digging into some concrete examples, really trying to understand what isn't changing for people, what's driving that dissatisfaction, because there could be a load of kind of things going on around the company, under the surface, team dynamics, all sorts of stuff. But then on the other hand, is it just everybody is super, they have super high expectations, they are really high performing, they're kind of driven to always be pushing on? I think that the nuances, and likely you'll be falling somewhere in between, hopefully. But those nuances really kind of inform how to have those conversations, where to go, what to do. But ultimately, I think with all of these topics, bringing it back to maintainability, the really, really important thing is not to be investing time for time's sake. It's to explain, it's to get everybody bought into and get the business understanding what the benefits are. So having those conversations on a really cross-functional basis, making sure that people understand what are the outcomes we're striving towards, what are we actually trying to achieve through this, and not just measuring metrics for metrics' sake.
Something that I've found in those types of situations where we'll talk to some engineers on a team and they're like, things are just not, we're spending all this time, but it doesn't seem like things are getting better. And then I will ask like, well, how is your team communicating like your little mini victories and successes when you're making these things? And they're like, well, we're pushing the things and like there's a PR process and things get merged and maybe there's a post in Slack or something about it. I'm like, oh, this might be an interesting challenge if like the team just doesn't have good habits of the culture isn't there. Like there's no one championing and like celebrating because they feel like all these small little incremental little improvements and they could like, but those things add up and like, but the people a couple steps away might not be seeing that and like in the greater picture, like, oh my gosh, like the test is running so much, it's 20% faster now that the test suite runs. And then what have you seen work well? Have you been in those situations and tried to like seen that work really well in some places? Because I feel like I've seen it work not so well in a lot of places.
Well, I think this is kind of perpetually my role as a leader of kind of larger teams. It's rarely on me nowadays to actually, kind of find something to improve and improve it and deliver it and just do it in isolation. So my role in engineering leadership is usually about trying to enable other people, trying to facilitate these kind of conversations, setting expectations, and getting everybody bought into the kind of cultural change that supports this more broadly, whether those are managers as part of the team or individuals, particularly when you've got a fantastically enthusiastic organization who, do have the knowledge, do have the skills, do have the energy to put into this kind of stuff. And you're able to sort of harness that power together. I think it can be super, super powerful. But as you say, there are lots of different pitfalls. There's ways where it can go really, really wrong. So I think that in terms of kind of like setting the culture for success, I would definitely say it is a team game. So I try to bring people on that journey. And if they're people that I'm hiring in, it will be part of the hiring process, not necessarily sort of, abrupt as tell me about a time when you've XYZ very specifically, but trying to understand aptitude, trying to understand proactivity, ownership, all of those kind of elements. And then when it comes to the existing team, growing juniors, growing people, I think it's really important to be clear as a leader in terms of the expectations that you have, to make sure that things like blue work are really championed, are really rewarded and recognized, showing examples of what good looks like. So with your example of kind of communication and celebration and stuff like that, it's something that I can live, but it's also something that you can just really deliberately ask people to do and say, hey, what are 5 things that people on your team have done amazingly well this week? Let's shine a light. Let's make sure they get the recognition. And sometimes these things spread organically. Sometimes, more often, they take a lot of work and repetition and kind of like embedding. But I think it's that mix of like the setting expectations, the being really deliberate in terms of what good looks like, what can help your cause. And then also just giving people space to try things, mess around, fail. What does it look like to celebrate in different ways? What does it look like to highlight those wins? All of that kind of good stuff, really.
Let's take a moment for the teams running Ruby apps. If your test coverage says 90%, there's a decent chance it's lying to you, because coverage didn't tell you what you didn't test in your last pull request. It just tells you a story about the past. That's where Undercover CI comes in. Undercover CI looks at your Ruby pull request and shows you exactly what changed and which parts of that change weren't tested, down to the method level. So instead of chasing a percentage, you're answering a better question. Did we actually test what we just merged? For teams maintaining long-lived Rails apps, this might hit a nerve. You don't need another dashboard. You need to see the gaps while the code is still fresh, during review, before they turn into bugs a week later. If that sounds familiar, it's worth a look. Head over to undercover-ci.com. It's free for public repos. Private repos start at just $69 a month per GitHub organization. And they've set up a code for listeners. Use Maintainable for 15% off your first billing cycle. Run it on your next PR and see what your coverage report didn't tell you. I like that. I think it's good for folks to think about that. But I also know that a lot of people listening to this podcast, the reason they particularly find some maybe solace with this podcast at times is hearing all these challenges that when you're dealing with like an older living application and maybe you've been there for a long time and the culture was maybe a certain way and it's maybe gone through some transitions and maybe the team looks very different today than it did 5 to 10 years ago and you've been there. And it's not that you're not enthusiastic and wanting to make things better, but maybe there's people listening, or let's just assume there's some people listening right now that feel like they care. They're listening to the podcast. They want to trying to come up with some like little nuggets of ideas or inspiration to be like, all right, I can try something different. And maybe they feel like they've advocated for things, but then heard maybe not necessarily pushback, but like maybe not right now a few too many times. So they stop asking or stop proposing things. Do you have any advice for like how to start helping change that narrative a bit?
I feel for those people. I feel like there's probably a whole ton of people out there tuning in for that reason. Yeah, it's a tough one because obviously it's the classic of it depends again. Everybody's situation is going to be so different. The hurdles, the people. I think knowing how to influence really positively is a fantastic skill. And I'll try and dig out a link. I'm not sure if she's doing workshops or anything, but I always think about Lara Hogan when it comes to this. She has an amazing workshop that helps people to understand how to influence positively. And when we think about influencing, we think about, somebody selling a car or something, like some dark patterns or something a little bit kind of that we don't maybe want to learn
manipulating,
how to do.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. Like salesy kind of stuff. We're engineers. We don't want to be salespeople, but we have to. And so whether it's knowing, okay, let's get this enormous, terrifying list of vulnerabilities. Let's look at the potential issues down the line in terms of incompatibility or, integration issues. What are the topics? What are the kind of like the big challenges that the people you are trying to influence care about? How can you actually relate what you want to do in terms of the maintenance to the things that they particularly are scared of or, can make their lives easier or whatever it is that you can kind of find that common language and meet them in the middle. But I think that there are some that our mind goes to. So, the vulnerabilities example is a very kind of, like it's a technical hurdle to overcome. But then there's other things as well that aren't necessarily thought about so naturally. So, for example, if you are running a code base which has a huge amount of debt. You're, maybe like versions and versions and versions back on something, or you're using some technologies that are a little bit more niche, maybe not completely the most exciting thing nowadays for people coming into the industry, or, really a load of fantastic performers. Are you going to be attracting the kind of talent that all your execs are telling you need to get in? Are your hiring cycle times going to be at a rate that meet the roadmap? All of these kind of more hiring problems or human problems, they're all very related. And I think that it's very interesting when you start to dig into the sort of secondary impacts, the knock-on impacts of some of the technical choices of not actually paying down debt or not investing in the maintainability of your code, where you end up with these other very, very important business challenges as well, that don't always see the light of day. So I think all of these bits are super interesting to me. Then they're not easy to solve necessarily. They especially don't change overnight. But if you don't start thinking about them now, then, now is the best time to start thinking about anything, no matter when you should have started thinking about it.
I agree with that. And one of the things you were touching on there is around, there is a as you're saying, a knock-on effect of like not addressing some of these types of, let's say, technical debt type issues, or things getting really outdated. And that could potentially become a retention and a recruitment challenge for your organization, because some people might not feel like they want to spend their time in taking care of things like that. Some people might be able to say, well, it also gives me a little bit of job security. I like working with that version of whatever because it was really great when it came out. I think there's an interesting, maybe separate conversation there around what's the best interest of the organization for whether or not a piece of technology, say, in vogue or not. And I think that's an interesting thing to, is this going to be something, because it's hard to predict a little bit also, like what technology is going to be, let's say, I'm air quoting for everybody listening, fashionable in 5 to 10 years from now. And like people are going to be feeling enthusiastic or work with that. How do you think about advising teams when they're assessing technology choices? Like, oh, we should definitely include this new technology because the engineering team is really excited to work with it because it might look good on the resume. But is that necessarily best decision for the organization itself? They're kind of like these conflicting, overlapping things we're trying to navigate as good stewards of our code bases that we're responsible for.
Yeah, the way that I think about that, and I absolutely agree, you can end up in the whole brilliant jerk situation, real single point of success. This is my thing. This is what I've always done. I'm going to make it very difficult for the company to change. And that in itself is its own kind of topic we might want to go into. But I think from my side as well, I'm not saying that you should just change for the sake of change. You should always be chasing the new shiny, because I've worked with some code bases that have been in existence for a very, very long time in tech years. They work, they are robust, they are well tested, they are a known quantity. And I think change for change's sake can introduce a whole host of problems in itself. There's also the fact that a lot of these kind of modernization projects, we see them as pain, we see them as risk, we see them as like, oh, we're going to have to persuade people. But I've also been lucky enough to work with some engineers that are fantastic at that sort of type of work, really love that type of work. It's the kind of like cleaning up mentality, making something better. And so I would say that in itself, knowing that kind of evolution is either coming up or is going to be ongoing isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's about how you kind of build it in. But to sort of go back to your bigger kind of question in terms of like the actual where things are going and like what is the new shiny? What's it going to look like in 5 years' time? For me, there is a difference between the very big, high risk, high blast radius strategic decisions that a company has to make. So things like, and this is just off the top of my head, but like on-prem versus cloud hosting it's a fundamental kind of paradigm shift that affects a lot of things. That is not something that teams should be just choosing on a whim, going, oh, hey, I want to play with this. So therefore we're going to like drive a huge budgetary decision, a huge kind of strategic decision. Where there are pieces of software in the stack, or where there are sort of elements of the roadmap where the blast radius, the risk is a lot smaller, then I think giving people the ability to kind of own those kind of decisions, but within, again, like an overall framework of decision making. You don't want to end up with 5 different types of databases, like 5 different approaches to databases even. You don't want to end up with 6 different programming languages because everybody had the freedom to choose. So I think it's about giving people the structure to make those decisions, to not be too controlling overall, but where there is some flexibility. You mentioned kind of developer experience, so developer tooling being a good one. It kind of fundamentally doesn't matter so much when you're kind of getting down to those smaller pieces of the puzzle, I'd say.
No, I can appreciate that. Thinking a little bit about, you touched on this a bit already, but like you've worked on a number of projects over the years that were involved where, say, overhauling some of the oldest parts of a company's code base. Are there any stories or experiences that you could walk us through a little bit, like what worked really well and maybe what you would consider doing differently nowadays?
Oh, what I'd consider doing differently nowadays. Yeah, I really, really enjoy these. I'm one of those people that does actually get a lot of satisfaction from modernization. So I think that there's a few that stick in my mind, but one of them that I'll talk you through was when I worked at a company where part of the product offering, part of the code base had been built a long time ago by one of the co-founders as the kind of like the foundational product. Back then they were working on very short, kind of like 3-6 month timelines for huge changes. They optimized for the ability to add value very quickly and didn't always take long-term maintainability into consideration, partly because they just wanted to, it's very startup-y. They wanted to ship fast, just get stuff done, but also because there was a lot of unknowns in terms of the company strategy, the product strategy. So everything it's the pivoting mentality. As the company grew, as it matured, as I came in a slightly later stage, there were factors like increased regulation. The legacy kind of elements had got to the point where even though you were optimizing for speed at the start, it had got to the point where now it was sort of starting to slow you down with all the different factors in consideration. You had things like reliability issues from some of the more flaky integrations that had been built a long time ago and then not, potentially kept up to date. But one of the biggest business concerns was the fact that data was kind of locked away, very siloed in this corner of the product world. So that led to some issues from a customer experience perspective. It also led to issues from the business perspective in terms of the business intelligence and having the overall picture. And then from a tech perspective, there were some challenges like having to think about, do we need to build out payment systems twice? All of this kind of siloing, segregation was causing a lot of headaches. So it got to the point where we needed to think about, are we actually going to do something big? What does it look like? Pitching this as an upgrade, but also an upgrade with value adds as well. And we ended up looking at a whole range of architectural options. It was a fantastic opportunity actually for some of the team to do that kind of work, to get to think through the options, like the trade-offs. And if I remember correctly, we really needed to work out what we wanted to optimize for ourselves at this point in time. So thinking about like the level of maintainability, the level of flexibility, but also setup costs and stuff like that. And as we've kind of touched on before, this doesn't come for free. You can't just go off and do your own tech project. So we needed to think about some of the factors that I mentioned, but really communicating to the business to what are the business drivers, which of the different options are going to need more investment, why should we prioritize this over that? And it was a very, I would say, like complex and demanding project, but one that we managed to get a lot of excitement behind. So from that sense, it was very, very successful, I would say. It was quite extensive. So we had a sort of a range of sub projects from kind of the changes that were needed on the front end through to API changes, and there was a huge data migration exercise as well. And we also had to sort of think about the impact on the org. So which team is going to take this? Do we need to do some, org design around it? What does the ownership look like? How do we communicate? All of that kind of stuff. And I think that one of the learnings, would I do anything differently? I feel like I should have a really kind of clean, here is the big takeaway. Here's the big mistake I made. But actually it's pretty successful. But I think that the big takeaway for me is to not underestimate that kind of foundational level. I was thankful that we had put in a load of work, that we did have good channels of communication, that we did have existing trust, that we had people, we had processes for kind of team changes, team moves. We weren't being too disruptive. I think without a lot of that kind of stuff, trying to take on too much would have been, would have swamped us. And I think that we were very grateful that it wasn't one of those projects that ended up being, the forever project that 2 years later you're still in the weeds and it's getting everybody down.
One of the things you said there, I think, is the most very critical part of, I think, that I assume. I'm assuming there's a few projects out there where you didn't need that existing trust with the organization and the different teams that you're going to be interacting with, and everybody that might be needing to potentially wait on some body of work to be finished before their priorities can move back up into the queue to be, like, hey, we're looking for these new features, or we want to deliver this for customers or for the sales cycles, whatever the integrations, all the things that our software is supposed to be malleable and integrate with. Like, sometimes those things need to get put on hold a little bit so that we can optimize things for ourselves as engineers, or just for the organization as a whole. Because when we are improving things for ourselves, we are helping the organization, I think, is an important takeaway as well. So do you have any, for those listening that feel like they're in a tricky situation where they don't feel like they have a lot of trust because maybe they're just seen as they're curmudgeon-y people that have been like, can you give us a little bit of time? Like, our estimates aren't reliable anymore. Whatever, if there's that trust has been eroded a little bit, or it just never existed for whatever reason, enough that they've been able to feel like they've gotten to propose these larger things. What sort of things could people start doing on a daily basis to start improving that?
On a daily basis, I think it's about building up some habits. So if you have if you don't have a kind of backlog, if you don't have a view of what the technical roadmap looks like into the future, what becomes a problem and when, mapping that out can be extremely powerful. So if you can kind of say, hey, in 6 months' time, I'm going to start having this conversation with you. This is the thing that I'm going to be super passionate about then. It gives people that heads up that actually, like, these are the key kind of topics. I think also, if you are able to go through, and it can take a bit of time depending on the level of detail that you want to get into. But if you want to really invest in looking at a bit of a sort of heat map of the areas that are more or less critical, and you can, I can't think of the structure off the top of my head, but I can maybe try and share something after the fact in the show notes or something like that. But trying to map out the areas that you're thinking about, the complexity of the level of change, the risks of doing or not doing it, what the investment would be, what the kind of scheduling would be. Again, kind of like breaking that down to help prioritize, to highlight the benefits of doing or not doing, I think can be really, really powerful. But fundamentally, you kind of touched on it, this isn't, it shouldn't be necessarily in isolation. Sometimes, you get something that's like, we just need to do something that is very behind the scenes and very painful, but always trying to frame it in the terms of the business benefit, what it will unlock, what it negates. It could be moving faster. It could be revenue. It could be risk mitigation. It could be compliance. There's a number of different lenses that you can look through these challenges with. And it's also the classic, can you build it into another project? Is there something that is tangential, adjacent, that actually you can just put a few more weeks in, chip away at this stuff and get it in that way?
Hey listeners, it's Robby here. It wasn't all that long ago I'd find myself debugging a weird issue in one of our clients' Rails app. I log into one platform to track down the error, only to realize it was tied to some performance issue. And guess what? That meant hopping over into a completely different tool and trying to match things up based off of timestamps, if I was lucky. And let me tell you, my productivity didn't exactly thank me for that. Enter AppSignal, our podcast sponsor, and the tool that eliminates all that back and forth. They bring error tracking, performance monitoring, host metrics, custom metrics, uptime monitoring, and logging into one seamless platform. It's a single source of truth that helps keep your app running like a well-rehearsed symphony. Whether you're working with Ruby, Elixir, Node, Python, or tracking front-end errors in JavaScript, AppSignal has your back. They're always adding support for more languages and frameworks too. And here's the best part. AppSignal won't break the bank. Plans start at just $23 US a month. Plus, they're ISO 27001 certified and fully GDPR and HIPAA compliant, so your data is safe. Oh, and because you're a loyal Maintainable listener, you can use the promo code Maintainable at checkout for 10% off your first year. So head over to appsignal.com. Tell them that your good friend Robby from Maintainable sent you and start making your app sing. Something you also mentioned there was it kind of sounded like maybe your advice would not be to, all right, so for the next several months, I'm going to pull together all these ideas, and then I'm going to one day just schedule a meeting and have a presentation, and I'm going to walk you through this big idea, like we should do this, and like surprise them with this big grandiose vision. Are you not advocating for that?
Surprises usually only go down well when they're nice surprises, and I don't think that's usually the way that people get on board. So yeah, that's probably not what I would do. I'm more as a leader, I like to listen to people. I like to understand how folks are feeling. It can be extremely stressful if you just drop something in and everybody thinks, oh my goodness, so what, our roadmap is going out the window. I thought I had control. I thought I knew what was going on. So yeah, probably not my favorite approach, but I would also say that it also does depend a little bit on who you're talking to, who you're pitching to, the folks you're talking to, the ones that would be doing this work. If so, they probably have views on this. If you're kind of, top down dictating, that might work in some cultures, but in other cultures, that is a surefire way to just annoy everybody. And again, going back to retention.
Oh, there goes Robby again.
Yeah.
So maybe set the scene, build it up, listen to people, and reflect back what you heard in those conversations. Like what I'm hearing from all these people. And like, I think one of the other challenges sometimes people have is not taking I have this great idea and then kind of hoarding it too much for themselves in a way when they present it to other people. And I think if you're not sharing how, I'm saying this out loud and I'm immediately thinking of something I did last week where I feel like, oh, I totally dropped the ball on that part of it. I'm like, I have a great idea. And I'm like, oh yeah, I probably should have included a little bit more of my team's input in that. Note to self. All right. So anyways, another thing I wanted to touch on with you, Sally, was I also understand that you've helped teams transition away from, say, long-standing in-house software systems. How did those conversations usually begin with engineering teams?
Well, this can be a tough one because I think on the one hand, you've got people who are frustrated, have been experiencing pain points, are really keen to look at other options. And then maybe you've got folks who've worked on a system. And as I mentioned, I've seen some fantastic systems that have lasted 20 years or something. You might have some people there from the old days who are like, this is my baby. Moving away from this brings a lot of feelings to them. So I would say that any big kind of, whether it's, a full redevelopment or just a fundamental kind of paradigm shift, is going to take a bit of time laying that groundwork to get people on board, but also to have the right plans, the right technical roadmap and that side of things too. So it's a combination of the sort of the strategic decision making, the tactical implementation plan, and then everything around it. So one of the examples that I'm thinking of was at a company I was working at, we had a company priority was in this particular area that the software related to. The systems were very customized. They'd done a fantastic job. They'd served very well. But increasingly, you were sort of seeing these challenges coming in. There was a lot of bloat from the classic, like everything being put in, new features being added on. The UI wasn't necessarily holding up, but also there was less historical expertise over time. So we still did have some people who were there firsthand, but we're losing that. There was a lack of documentation, lack of knowledge sharing. There was also some sort of remnants of previous culture gone by. So documentation being in a completely different language, for example. And I think on the whole, there was a sentiment that the system was quite fragile, quite scary. It took people a long time to be comfortable making changes. And then when you get incidents, people get woken up in the middle of the night. They're kind of like, wow, this is challenging. Where do I start? And that was all playing out with things like an increasing need to factor in quite a lot of staffing in terms of just the keeping the lights on, the business as usual, let alone the sort of the complexities of building stuff in for the future. So I think over the years, there'd been a couple of decision points of like, is this something that we look to move away from, whether through rebuild or through looking at vendors? And for a long time, I don't think the sort of third-party vendor options were quite there, which shut some of those conversations down quite fast. But then we got to a point where they had matured. They were actually a serious option for us to consider. And they would actually be bringing different benefits as well. So the whole kind of like background was, I'd say, the conversation was a long time coming. Then when you actually kind of move into the tactical, okay, what does this look like? How do we actually make a decision? There are the practical elements. So mapping the existing capabilities to vendor capabilities. What are the aspirations? What do we need? What do we get rid of? All of that kind of side, looking at privacy, security, all the due diligence pieces. But then, as you mentioned, there's the kind of like, that's my baby, the mindset shift. And I think there are different ways to approach this. As I mentioned, I'm very keen to make sure that we're listening to concerns, to consult, to make sure that if we're gathering concerns, we can use those to get the best outcome possible, because they may be very, very valid. And these people have a lot of fantastic expertise. But I think that what really helped me was to make sure that we were sort of showing the working, that these decisions hadn't just come out of left field and we were doing it because it had a nice name or something. It was showing the reasoning, showing the metrics, if you've got the impact again of changing or not changing, trying to have some narrative around why this is exciting, what it might free us up to do. Can we give people learning opportunities? Are people going to be woken up less in the middle of the night? Again, like, what do people care about? And I think a really important point was to never negate the good that was done. It's very easy to start kind of just saying, criticizing, saying all the bad things about the old system, which can really bring on that defensiveness. But ultimately, once you've kind of done all that, once you've tried to help people feel heard, once you've tried to communicate effectively and regularly and given updates, there will inevitably be some people that don't agree. And that is okay. But I think what is very important there is to explain what is going to happen, and that it's the kind of, you can disagree and we will commit anyway. To be super clear on who is the final decision maker. This is not necessarily a decision by consensus. We're not all going to agree is very different to, we're going to consult and then so-and-so will be the decision maker. Having all of that out there, I think, again, helps people understand what is going on and how they kind of fit into the mix, what role they can play, so that they can feel heard, but then they're not going to get super grumpy if it's like, but I don't agree, but you're going ahead anyway.
Yeah, there's a lot of things I think we could probably dig into. I think in those types of situations, like where if you have a very customized piece of software that has been built, got in your organization to where it is today, and now there is something maybe air quoting, off the shelf, you could maybe tap into that gets you 80-90% of, and then you could add your secret sauce on top of it somehow, or figure out ways to do that. Sometimes that also might mean that your engineering team may not be the size it needs to be anymore to support that new infrastructure. It's not just protecting your baby you've been working on. You're also, there's a little bit of a self-preservation, like, well, what does it mean for me? And I think that's a very human thing to think about when these things are coming up. And it's like in these roles where you have to assess these situations to make the organization thrive and But there's new opportunities that pop up in those situations too. And so how do you think teams often have those conversations enough because they're afraid to like talk about the elephant in the room that like this might mean a few less coworkers if this is successful?
Yeah, that's a really great point. And I think that it is very often a very natural fear that people have of, is my job tied to this specific system or, to this specific technology? What is going to happen if it goes away? And going right back to the start of our conversation of the hiring, if you're actually changing something really fundamental, so not even like, switching something to be an off the shelf tool, but maybe your whole business is deciding to bring in a new programming language, that is going to be an extremely challenging, vulnerable time. People are going to have all of these questions of like, what does this mean for me, my family, my mortgage? And so I think that when you are thinking about these kind of changes, whether it's kind of, at a team-based level of this is what my team owns, it's going to change, right through to the huge tech strategy changes that could maybe affect everybody in a business. It's having enough conversations within a sort of closed group to get to a certain point of clarity. Is this definitely happening? Do we not, is it something that we're going to look at options and consult with people? Is it something that we don't really know, and so we're kind of just feeling our way around? Getting to a certain point of clarity where you can have a very distinct message, you can try to, share to people. And also I would say have those conversations as a small closed group is a driver of this reduction of headcount. Hopefully it's not. I'm a big believer of the fact, as I mentioned before, if you're kind of freeing up people's time to be more effective, there's always a million things that need to be done, need to be built. So for me, changing to something that's off the shelf is not a natural partner with, and so we're going to lay these people off. But in some cases, those conversations, might be very different. And it might be the case that folks are thinking about that. So what you don't want to do is give mixed messaging. You don't want to give unintentionally ambiguous messaging. If it's a case that you have decided that you are going to be looking at third-party vendors for a certain system, you don't know which one yet, and it's not a definite that you will switch, you just want to do that exercise. I think that in itself, having that kind of clarity can be useful. And then if people come and say, is this going to mean that our team doesn't have a role anymore? Knowing the answer to that, being able to give them something, being able to work with the managers around, to be able to have an appropriate level of transparency, I think is super important. But again, the company culture will differ in so many different ways that the way that I approach things is not always, I'd say, necessarily as easy as I might sort of make it out to be right now.
Sure. For those listening, I'm not thinking everybody needs to worry that their management layer is going to start investigating all these different off-the-shelf solutions. I'm just thinking of those few rare situations that does pop up. One thing I wanted to, I was kind of curious, it did make me think about, and something I wrote a little bit about and recently as well on my own blog, which is that I feel like sometimes when engineers are hired during, let's say, growth spurts where the team's growing, and so teams will make architectural choices kind of on the assumption that their team's going to keep growing. But sometimes an optimal situation is maybe to have a slightly smaller team because that's a much more sustainable approach for the organization. But I don't know that teams think about that enough because have you found yourself having those kinds of conversations like, great, we're going to scale up for a while, but maybe you don't need to hire full-time engineers. We can bring in some external help to work on that. Like that's where consulting companies like my company come in those situations. But the idea is that like, we won't need them in a year and a half. So let's not overcommit ourselves that we're like, what are people going to do in a year and a half from now if actually we're going to not be moving as quickly as we are today to build out this big new initiative that we're working on? How do you think about those types of things?
I've worked at places that have been kind of like flat in terms of growth. I've also been through hypergrowth. I've seen reductions too. So, kind of seen all the sides of the spectrum there. But you're right. It's a conversation that I think everybody should be having in terms of the maintenance angle of the software and the ownership and the the sort of like the overheads. Having that very early on when you're actually making architectural decisions or deciding on scope or, kind of thinking a little bit ahead in terms of some of, even down to, some of the practicalities of on-call and things like that. How is it all going to work in 6 months, in a year? If we have the same velocity in terms of the type of projects that we're picking up, what does it look like for these to kind of become cumulative? And I think this is where it's really important for leaders to have a clear vision and a clear articulation of what is the company strategy? Is the strategy to grow? Is it to kind of like continue expanding the technology suite, that, the systems that are being created? Is the growth of the team, the sort of the org side, as you mentioned, is that in line with the product strategy or the vision or, whatever type of company you might be working for? If it's not, then you've got a real problem immediately. So I would say, let's slow down and look at it a little bit. But absolutely, I think having teams know the realities that just adding more people into the mix is very complex. It's not necessarily going to help solve all the problems, but instead thinking about, do we invest in things that people need to own? Do we invest in automation now? What are the boundaries of what this could look like at scale? Where does it break? All of those, I think, are super important to have early so that you can then, again, try to make the best decisions you can at any one point in time with the knowledge that you had.
Hey folks, we'll be back with Sally in just a moment. It's Robby here. I want to share a quick thought about something we see a lot. A company has a software platform that's been around for years. It still runs the business, but over time it gets harder to change. Harder to upgrade, harder to move forward. And eventually someone says, maybe should we just scrap this fucking thing and rewrite it? At Planet Argon, we believe something different. Good software deserves a second act. Instead of throwing everything away, we help teams modernize what they already have. That might mean upgrading the frameworks, improving test coverage, or untangling technical debt so the system becomes easier to evolve again. Sometimes we guide the work. Sometimes we embed with your team through fractional development or team augmentation. Either way, the goal is the same. Help your team move forward with confidence. If that sounds familiar to you, you can learn more at planetargon.com/second-act. That's planetargon.com/second act. All right, let's get back to the show. I appreciate that. I want to be mindful of your time, Sally, and I want to kind of get your advice for those listening. And we didn't get to dive into maybe all the scenarios, but for someone, let's say that's maybe going to be starting a new job and they're going to start a new job, but most jobs are joining organizations that usually have existing software. You don't usually get to be there day one and spin up the brand new application. If you do, great. That's great for you. But most of us don't get to live in that world most of the time. And maybe they're feeling a little intimidated because it's going to be, say it's a 15-year-old system and they're starting next week and they're nervous going into that. And what advice could you offer them about how to start diving into that? Because maybe they feel like they haven't done that for a long time because they've been at another company for a really long time. It's a whole new thing, whole new infrastructure, whole new system, whole new team dynamics, but specifically around maybe the technology side of that.
Great question. For me, there's two sides of this. There's the kind of the tech side, which I would say if it's a tech stack that they're familiar with, but it's maybe just kind of code that is a little bit challenging to work with, being quite polite there. Then, can they make use of, what options are available to them in terms of, I mentioned documentation earlier, in terms of things like onboarding guides or quick start kind of exercises that people might have set up in the past. If those things don't exist, it can also be super powerful and it can help people really make their mark very early if they're onboarding and flagging up. Here's where I could have really have done with more documentation, or actually, if we created this little exercise to get people to walk through this, that would be useful for everybody that comes after me. I am loath to dive into this because I know that a lot of people have covered it in a lot more depth, but obviously, does the company have access to AI tooling? Can you kind of make use of that? Are there any other, options that you've got there to actually get your mental models up to speed as quickly as possible and to know the questions that you should be asking? On the human side of it, though, I would say, what is this company offering? Would you feel able to ask for an engineering buddy, an onboarding buddy? Is there somebody to go to that you could feel safe to ask questions? That might be a no. It might just be you've got your manager, which is a very challenging power dynamic for somebody to come in and feel like they can't ask the, air quotes again, stupid questions. So I think it's really worth thinking about how this new person, how do they work well? How do they learn? Do they want to try and find somebody that they can sit and like pair with? Or is there somebody that they just want to be able to ping some questions if they get stuck, who is kind of set up for that? So yeah, I think for me, it's the mix of like the tech, the tooling, and then the people side. But also I would naturally say to this person, yeah, maybe they haven't done it for a while, but to have confidence, to be kind to themselves. They're probably not the only person struggling with this. If it's a challenging system, then there will probably be others. And again, there are probably opportunities there, maybe for better knowledge sharing, maybe for ways that they could actually come in and improve everybody's confidence or improve things for the wider community. So to be mindful of those, to make a note of those and maybe look for opportunities to bring them up and sense check those with others too.
I like that. I'm actually a little envious of that person. So if someone actually is going to be starting a job in the next week or so, I'm envious of you because I've got to do that in a really long time. And like, if I were to ever, I always think about like those first few days and first few weeks, and something that we talk about with because we're often guests in other teams' code bases as consultants, right? And so we do get to re-experience this a little bit more frequently, maybe than someone has a job at a company, and where we have to come in. And like, one of the things that we've always tried to, in our handbook, is try to remind people, like, don't just point out the challenging things, like highlight the things that the team's doing really good as well. Like, validate, like, oh, this README is really great. Oh, this guide that I use, because if you're not, that's an opportunity to kind of speak up and like share a little bit, and you can start praising, even if you haven't understood the team's existing cultural norms about how to celebrate and praise things, because sometimes we work on these documentations and we don't know if anyone ever really finds them valuable. And you're like, so you're like, I don't know, and like, use it useful to keep it updated as often as we do. If you find something useful, it's in the same way that I'm trying to encourage people also, if you found someone's blog post to be super valuable, you should let them know. And it might encourage them to keep writing more blog posts, because it's a little quiet out there. Or if you listen to a podcast, it's a very one directional medium. So if you're listening to this in your Spotify app or whatever, yes, you can write a review or whatever, but feel free to reach out to the host and the guests and say, hey, I really enjoyed that conversation. We want to know you're listening.
I've actually been really lucky with that. And I think
that's awesome.
I used to be a lot more prolific in terms of writing blog posts, and parenthood has slightly stripped my energy from me. But actually the amount of people that have kind of said things to me over the years of like, oh, this blog post or that blog post have been super useful. It is, like you say, it is super motivating. And so, yeah, I completely agree. Coming into a new company, stating those nice things, giving the positivity back as well, I think is really useful. And also just kind of taking some of the decisions with a pinch of salt and a little bit of grace. So as I mentioned in my story of, companies maybe were optimizing for something very different when this code was written to now. And so not kind of just being too judgy. You didn't know all of the context. You haven't kind of lived through what people have done. So having an open, curious mind, I think will set people up really well. But yeah, I think that, and the other thing that came to mind when you were speaking was just trying to build relationships with people as humans, because whether it's the team around them, but also, more kind of like cross-functional peers, sharing an interest, showing that curiosity, building relationships, I think will stand them, this hypothetical person that I'm increasingly growing to care about, in very good stead. So hopefully that helps somebody out there starting a new job, and good luck.
Yes, good luck. Sally, is there a non-technical, non-software, non-programming book that you recommend to peers?
There are so many. I read a lot. The disclaimer here is it's mostly sci-fi and like set in space and things like that. So I think I actually have a personal site which is purely for my reading and my video games, and that is small-reviews.netlify.app, because I did not want to get myself into another domain name that I never give up again. I reread all of the Murderbot series last year after a couple of years, and that is just, I still absolutely love it. But there have been some other really, really great books. I recently finished, it's sort of semi-sci-fi, a book called Death of the Author, which is absolutely fantastic. And yeah, I've got just a ton of things on my to-read list. I'm trying to think of some other ones off the top of my head. But yeah, there's a load on that website if you want to dig through.
Yeah, we'll definitely include links to, you said Murderbot and series and Death of the Author in the show notes, and get a link to that, your sci-fi and gaming website as well for our listeners.
The disclaimer is it's like written for me, so I remember what I've done.
Okay,
so
perfect.
Yeah, don't like take too much from it.
Okay, that sounds great. And where can listeners follow your thoughts, ruminations about software engineering online?
Listeners can follow my thoughts if I actually write them down and have the time to on my blog, which is at sallylate.com/blog. I am on Mastodon, mastodon.social. I'm at Sally on there. Again, it's mostly pictures of things like my garden or recently some moss and stuff like that. So much more on the non-tech side. But like you said, it's always great to know if people appreciate things, if you've got things that you'd like to encourage me to write about. So I have that motivation. But yeah, that's where you can find me.
Well, thank you so much. It's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable, Sally. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop with us today.
Oh, likewise. Thanks for having me. And yeah, great chat.
You've been listening to Maintainable, a Planet Argon production. Editing by Claudia Armbruster. Post-production by Autumn Morgan and Ellis Fenson. Emotional support from the letter M. For Maintainable, for momentum, for making things better. If this episode resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Keep showing up.